They paid me to solve problems, they never paid me for futures. When I joined Ardent Systems, I was 27 and full of small, precise certainties. Lines of code could be coaxed into elegance, software could be made to hum like a well-tuned engine, and if I worked an extra hour, the world would tilt a degree in my favor. I drank coffee that tasted like ambition, wore a sweater because it was cheaper than a suit, and learned the rhythms of the building, the soft clack of keyboards in the morning, the clip of heels that meant the HR manager was near, the way the CTO rubbed his forehead when a deployment failed. The payment platform was my child. I remember the nights, the glow of the monitor, the rhythm of problem and solution, the quiet satisfaction when a complex flow finally made sense. It wasn't about money then. It was about making something that worked, that removed friction for people who were trying to do ordinary things: pay a bill, send money home, sell a service. The architecture came together like a song. We modularized the core, hardened the auth flows, planned for growth. I wrote tests like prayers. 6 months, that was all it took. The platform launched and the revenue graph started to look like someone had drawn a vehicle speedometer and then punched it. Clients moved from trial to contract. Transactions became steady and then obscene by our previous standards. In a company that had been scraping by, the platform became an axis. Interns bragged about us in Slack, press releases used words like disruptive, and the CEO took to telling stories at investor dinners about how we were redefining payments. People clapped, investors smiled. I got an email saying good job from the CTO and a handshake in the corridor. And then, in the small, ordinary way that betrayal often prefers, a memo, then a meeting, they told me I was no longer needed. They gave me a reason that was both particular and ridiculous: reorganization, new direction, streamlining resources. The CEO, a man who had flown in a private jet for talks and whose smile was practiced at company socials, said it with a softness that made the words land like a hand over my mouth. They offered a severance package that fit neatly into the frame of their public relations image. We appreciate your contributions. It felt obscene. Betrayal is rarely cinematic. There was no dramatic outburst, no slammed door. There was only the CEO's calm eyes and the hum of the HVAC and the distant river of people in cubicles, all of them continuing on as if tenure were a currency they had been born to spend. The HR woman said, "We'll support you." The words dropped like coins to a marble floor, bright then dead. I walked out of that meeting feeling as if someone had reduced my life to a spreadsheet row and hit delete. That night I didn't sleep. Anger set like cement. Memory supplied shape, 1,000 small instances where I'd chosen not to speak up, where I'd fixed a bug at 2 in the morning so the demo would go well, where I'd swallowed a snide comment from a manager in front of a client, because winning the account felt like a ladder rung I needed. I had trusted a company that measured me by the revenue I generated, and then discarded me when my usefulness had been tallied and reconciled. There was grief in it, not for money, not just for the humiliation, but for the quiet, daily surrender of dignity that comes when you realize your loyalty was accounted as an expense. I called the people I trusted. Some were predictable. No one wanted to be the person who stuck a knife in their own career for me. Some were surprising. Bob from security, who had once tutored me on cryptography in the break room, answered at 3 in the morning and heard me out. His voice over the line was careful. "Felix," he said, "there are things you can do that won't break you." I told him haltingly about the encrypted schema backup I kept. It was a professional reflex. Good engineers archive in ways that keep systems safe. I knew the argument already, that I should do nothing, that burning bridges would be petty, that I should be bigger than the insult. There were practicalities. I had an encrypted copy of the architecture, of the migration scripts, of the deployment pipelines, the skeleton of what made the platform hum. I also knew that the clients relied on Ardent's update cadence and hosted services. Take away the bridge and the house remains, but the passage to it becomes a problem. Bob didn't encourage any criminality. He didn't coach me on methods. He told me to sleep and to think about consequences. Anger fades, he said, but the record of how you respond doesn't. I didn't want the fade. I lay awake and thought of the way the CEO's eyes had been kindly and empty, calculating his public image like an accountant constructs ledgers. The company had used me and used my work to remake itself, then placed me in the back room like an obsolete machine. They had not seen me as a person, they had seen me as a line item that could be optimized. The betrayal required a story. I wanted what it gave to people who write revenge novels: not violence, not instruction, but an economy of consequence, a result that cut at reputation, that forced accountability without becoming criminal. The plans I made then were not recipes for sabotage, they were an insistence that the truth take up the space that silence had ceded. I wrote a letter instead of an email because letters have weight. I filled it with things the company had forgotten. I documented timelines, my work logs, the pull requests where the critical fixes had been made, the late-night messages from clients thanking me for resolving a dangerous bug. I gathered financial snapshots, public statements, and internal pitch decks that showed the CEO's promises in glossy, ambitious language. I assembled evidence not because I wanted to ruin anyone, I didn't, but because facts are hard to argue with when words are malleable. Then I did the thing I promised myself I would not. I took the encrypted file. Not because I wanted to break the platform, I never wanted to be a vandal, but because for the first time in months the file was a form of leverage that could be wielded without blood. I kept it hidden in the socket of a laptop I unplugged and let sit like a sleeping animal. I didn't post it to the internet. I didn't email it to a rival. I held it like a hot coal and learned its shape. I told no one. If there are choices that make us feel monstrous, this was one. I felt the moral weight in the way my hands trembled when I opened my front door. I thought of the clients who would be inconvenienced, and I thought of the reality that sometimes the wounded party in a corporate betrayal is not just one individual but an ecosystem: vendors, junior engineers, clients who had trusted us with money. The idea of revenge that harmed innocence ate at me. So I resolved, if I was going to strike, it would be surgical, visible, and it would expose, not conceal. The days after the firing were rigorous in the way grief is. They had a shape and rhythm and little room for improvisation. I rented a small room above a bakery and let the smell of proof dough and butter become background. I worked freelance for a while, taking small gigs that paid in cash and pride. The world didn't stop, bills arrived on schedule, friends asked how I was, my inbox filled with polite recruiters promising opportunities to leverage your platform expertise. But the object of my attention remained the same: what it meant to be replaced and what justice might look like. Revenge is often romanticized as a purge, a single moment of catharsis. Real life doesn't allow that luxury. Truth is granular, and so must be the response. I studied the company the way I had once studied flows of events, where their revenue came from, who their partners were, how clients renewed. I read investor memos and press releases. I listened to conversations that made their rounds in industry circles. The more I learned, the less this felt personal and more systemic. The CEO had built a persona on rescuing a failing company. The platform I had built had become his headline. He had cultivated a narrative in which saviors and smarts were cloaked in charm. The more charming he was in public, the less accountable he had been in private. I drafted a plan that had no malice for the clients and no desire to ruin livelihoods. I wanted truth in the daylight. If they had fired me for reorganization, then let the record show what the reorganization had cost. Not vengeance as obliteration, but as exposure. First, I reached out to one client, a small fintech that had integrated our API, the kind of customer you root for in a world of faceless corporations. I didn't threaten them. I called them and introduced myself not as an avenger but as the person who had built the system they were trusting. I told them plainly that I had been severed, and I described without jargon the architecture's fragility around undocumented dependencies that had not been disclosed to their engineering team. I told them I was concerned for their continuity and offered to help them prepare a contingency plan as a professional courtesy, not because I expected compensation. The client was wary, but curiosity triumphed over caution. They had seen their transaction slippage rise and they had sensitive clients of their own. We arranged a call. I walked them through scenarios, downtime windows, migration options, how a staged rollback might look in the worst case. I did not talk about the file I had taken. I talked about professional ethics and I offered to help them with risk assessment. The conversation ended with an awkward thanks and an invitation for continued dialogue. That small, human exchange distilled something for me. It reminded me that the platform did not exist for our glory, it existed for real people making payments that mattered. My anger had to be aimed at those who had orchestrated my dismissal and not at the clients who had trusted us. I began to write, not code, words. I wrote a white paper in which I outlined best practices in handling vendor lock-in, in which I used anonymized examples that mirrored my experiences. I peppered it with case studies that tracked from design to deployment, emphasizing transparency, documentation, and client autonomy. It was a gentle polemic about accountability. I published it on my personal blog under my name. It got a handful of reads. The internet is patient. But what it did quietly was create a breadcrumb trail. My writing signaled to clients and to anyone who cared that I had thought critically about vendor relationships. It was easy then for a journalist, one who covered fintech and praise on narratives where David meets Goliath, to find my work. The journalist reached out with blunt curiosity. We spoke for hours. I told the story of the platform, my role, and why the practices that had looked like prudence in boardrooms were in fact brittle for those who trusted them. I excerpted emails where promises were made and not kept. I left out the encrypted file. The article ran 2 weeks later. The headline was sharp: Former architect says payment platform left clients vulnerable. The piece didn't name every company, it quoted executives cautiously, but the effect was like pouring cold water on a painted mural, cracks showed. Investors asked questions in board meetings. Clients demanded remote audits. The CEO, always polished, found himself answering a litany of pointed queries at investor calls. His smile remained, but the edges were frayed. For the first time, the company's narrative required defense rather than offense. My satisfaction was not immediate or visceral, it was slow and precise. People began to ask for more information. Some called me a disgruntled ex, some called me a whistleblower. Neither label fit exactly. I had not sought to destroy, I had sought to reveal what I believed to be dangerous complacency. There were shows of solidarity from unlikely places. A junior engineer at Ardent, someone I had helped onboard, sent me a message that said simply, "We were never allowed to document migrations properly." That message hurt more than it helped. I wasn't interested in building an army, I was trying to set the record straight. When the company tried to push back with denials, I answered with facts that couldn't be spun. I produced public pull request timestamps, non-confidential logs, and examples of claims the company had made about client autonomy that did not match the product reality. This was not sabotage, it was truth-making. With the article published and questions proliferating, the company's posture shifted from confident to cautious. Shareholders wanted reassurances. Clients demanded service-level attachments and contingency plans. When a large merchant announced they had experienced a delayed reconciliation window, the board called an emergency meeting. I watched from a distance, not with glee but with the sober recognition of what had been started. The CEO issued a statement about ongoing enhancements and commitment to clients, and the PR team choreographed him like a man on a stage. It was an elegant performance, and for a moment such displays had their desired effect. Markets paused, then resumed their attention elsewhere. But someone had to stand up in the room where the truth was most dangerous: operations. One evening, in one of those small strange coincidences life favors, the CEO visited a client site in person. He gave a talk about innovation and leadership. The audience clapped because that is what audiences do. Afterwards in the lobby he bumped into an old acquaintance who ran a mid-sized payments company. The acquaintance, frank and tired from dealing with integration nightmares, said, "You know, your platform is great, but we worry what happens if we need to move." The CEO's smile slipped. He began to promise features that weren't scheduled and roadmaps that hadn't been realistically budgeted. That night, an investor took notes. Word circulated that a class action suit might arise, a rumor but the kind that grows teeth. Clients began to ask for escrow arrangements and for third-party audits. A few asked for the source code to be escrowed with a neutral third party, a mechanism meant to reassure clients if a provider failed. When Ardent balked, citing IP risk, the clients became sterner. The relationship drifted. It was in that atmosphere that I was contacted by a procurement director of a major client. The director had read the article and asked bluntly, "Would you help us get out of an unhealthy dependency?" There was no hint of malice in his tone, only pragmatism. I explained what could be done without handing over anything illicit. I advised on contingency measures, drafting clear exit clauses, and insisted that any migration should be done by the client's own engineers or a neutral auditor. He thanked me and said they would take the steps. My encrypted file sat in the drawer of a rented desk, inert and heavy. It had done nothing and everything. Its existence was a moral variable I had not wanted to use as a weapon. But its presence changed calculations because it made me real in the eyes of those who had once dismissed me. I had leverage I hadn't asked for. Ardent's board convened a crisis team and launched internal audits. They reissued documentation, hired consultants to build migration guides, and promised transparency. The promises were performative in many ways, but promises have gravity. When the pressure of public scrutiny meets business economics, the result is often small concessions that compound. The CEO offered to meet me, face to face, his message said, for closure. The language was oily with civility. He wanted the optics of reconciliation. I accepted not for the handshake, but because I wanted to watch him navigate the quiet where truth and image collide. We met in a study room at a members-only lounge. He arrived with the same practiced charm, the same press-ready laugh. He expected I would be a man showing up to negotiate his exit. Instead, I walked in with evidence, emails, timelines, the white paper's printouts, and placed them on the table like detritus. His face changed in small but telling ways, an eyebrow lifted, a jaw tightened, a politician discovering that voters had read the fine print. Felix, he said, we believed in the product, we believed in you. This, he tapped the stack of documents. You believed in a story you told investors, I said. You believed that you could replace people who build things and not carry the cost. He smiled thinly. This is a misunderstanding, we followed process. You lived in the narrative, I said. You never wanted process to slow you. He tried to charm me, to offer a financial settlement that would look generous on paper and quiet me in private. The offer was significant enough to purchase silence for a while and to stitch a new life without the acrid taste of daily reminders. Many would have taken it. I thought of the bakery downstairs and the smell of bread and the city that went on. The money would have been a soft cure for humiliation. But I had tasted the wind of public accountability and found it not unbearable. I wanted something else, acknowledgement. What do you want? He asked, as though the question were a negotiation of terms. I told him I wanted a public acknowledgement, a statement to clients that recognized the shortcomings in documentation, and an agreement to support clients' migrations without obstruction. I wanted a commitment to escrow arrangements for the clients who needed them, and I wanted a small internal shift, guarantee positions for engineers who had been neglected and clear channels for technical transparency. Nothing dramatic, no demand for his resignation, no need for dramatic ruin. I wanted the company to be steadier and clients safer. He hesitated. The optics of apology are a delicate instrument. Investors do not always like confessions, but the alternative was a slow erosion of client trust and shareholder discomfort. He measured and weighed as men like him do and finally nodded. Make your conditions public, he said, and I will sign. I left that meeting with a hollow feeling that was not victory. It was a moral trade-off, the kind grown-ups make when they choose lesser harms for greater good. I returned home and drafted terms, nothing about the encrypted file, nothing of vengeance masquerading as ethics. I placed the conditions on my blog, on legal counsel's letterhead, and through the journalist who had first told my story. The demands were modest and were couched in the language of safety: third-party code escrow, transparent migration documentation, a publicly visible client assurance roadmap. The public pressure tightened. The CEO, after consulting lawyers and investors, issued a statement acknowledging deficiencies in internal practices and promising to enact the measures I had requested. He framed it as a maturation moment for the company. The board approved a budget for client assurance workstreams and asked the CTO to lead. Clients, mollified by the new commitments, began to relax. Some negotiated concessions, others asked for deadlines and independent audits. The company's stock, which had wavered, recovered somewhat. No catharsis for me, no applause, just a slow settling. Behind the scenes, however, the company engaged in a quieter, more pernicious motion. They attempted to recast my narrative as self-serving. Social posts and anonymous commentaries suggested I had acted out of spite. Certain legal letters appeared that hinted at IP violations and threatened consequences. My apartment received a visitor once, a man who looked like he belonged on an expense account, who left a card with an offer neither kind nor transparent. I did not feel threatened so much as watched. I kept the encrypted file where it was. It was no longer a weapon so much as an insurance policy against being steamrolled into silence. But more importantly, it was also an ethical burden I had to carry. It had given me leverage that was imperfectly used. I had chosen firmness over wreckage. The path I had walked was narrow and worn. The company changed not because I had unloaded a blow, but because public attention forced it to. My role in that change was messy and human, and far from the elegant retribution I had imagined in sleepless nights. I had not set out to be a moral pariah or a savior. I had wanted simply to be seen.
Revenge is loud when it begins, but it's the echoes that haunt. Months passed, the headlines faded the way all headlines do, replaced by newer scandals, brighter chaos, louder disasters. Yet inside Ardent Systems, the ripples didn't die. They moved silently, like waves under ice. The company's internal reforms, born out of my public demands, were underway. They had appointed a new chief integrity officer, launched Project Phoenix, a rebranding exercise meant to restore trust, and initiated an employee listening program. To the untrained eye, it was all progress. To those who lived inside the machinery, it was a quiet civil war. Some managers resisted the reforms, clinging to the old opacity that kept them relevant. Others, mostly the young engineers, saw in it a chance for fresh air. Memos leaked, internal documents that referenced the Felix protocols, a tongue-in-cheek nickname for the transparency measures I demanded. Every company has its mythology, and somehow I had become part of Ardent. Not as a villain, not as a hero. As the ghost in the system, the engineer who'd refused to disappear. I still coded, but for other companies now. Freelance contracts, secure, clean work. My reputation was complicated but alive. Some clients saw me as a symbol of integrity. Others saw risk, but work came steadily. I no longer had to explain who I was. The story had traveled farther than I intended. Still, there were days when I woke at 3 a.m. with a question lodged in my mind like a shard. Did I fix something or just break it differently? One such night, as slept under the chilled weather and sea air, my phone buzzed with a message. It was from Gina, a former junior developer I had mentored. She was still with Ardent. "Sir, I thought you should know, there's an internal audit report. They discovered code dependencies from your old architecture. The system is failing updates again. They're blaming you." I sat up slowly. The words felt heavy, not with fear but fatigue. I hadn't touched their system since leaving. I hadn't sabotaged anything. But the architecture had been mine, complex, layered, elegant, and without my documentation, the company's later engineers had clearly struggled to maintain it. Their incompetence had matured into accusation. 2 days later, my email filled with polite inquiries from journalists who'd caught wind of new issues at Ardent. Some wanted comment. Others wanted a quote to reignite the story. I said nothing. Silence was my first defense. Then a week later, the CEO broke it himself. At a press conference framed by silver backdrops and crisis PR, he smiled the way only polished liars can and said, "The system faced complications due to legacy design decisions made under previous leadership. We're rebuilding for the future." Legacy design decisions. That was me, erased, blamed, and posthumously useful. The irony burned deep. The very architecture that had made them millions now served as their scapegoat. And the worst part, I couldn't defend myself without revealing the encrypted file, and that would mean war. So I did what engineers do best when emotion fails. I analyzed. The more I watched, the more obvious their panic became. Clients grew nervous again. The CEO's attempts to distance himself from legacy design only reminded everyone that the legacy had once been profitable and stable until he tampered with it. Then the twist came. The journalist who'd once told my story, Jane, reached out again. "I have sources inside. They say the company's audit revealed you weren't the issue. The new team rewrote parts of your code, broke compatibility, and now it's chaos. Do you want to go on record?" I hesitated. Another story meant another storm. I'd already lived through one. "You can protect your name," she pressed, "or they'll bury you again." Truth, when ignored, grows teeth. I said yes. The article published under the title, "Inside Ardent's Second Collapse, When Profit Drowned the Engineers." It didn't paint me as a saint. Jane was too good a journalist for that. She described me as a brilliant but bruised developer whose ethical stand forced systemic reform. She also detailed how the company's board had ignored internal warnings about technical debt. The piece ended with a quote from an unnamed source. "Felix didn't destroy Ardent, he tried to save it. They just didn't want to be saved." The story went viral in the industry. Forums lit up. Tech blogs debated whether companies own their creators' legacies or just rented them. And investors, remembering the first scandal, began pulling back. The CEO held another press event, defensive, rehearsed, trembling under the surface. He talked of renewed focus and agile transformation, but his words were hollow. Ardent's stock dipped. A quarter later, the board quietly asked him to resign for health reasons. Justice doesn't always wear armor. Sometimes it walks in quietly, disguised as exhaustion. When I read the headline about his resignation, I felt nothing triumphant. No music swelled, no angels sang, only quiet, the kind that fills rooms after long storms. I closed my laptop and sat there, feeling the ache of completion and the faint sting of something else, grief. Not for him, but for what had been good before greed had entered the room. For the camaraderie of the early team. For the belief that merit alone could protect you. And then I realized something. Revenge isn't about punishment, it's about balance. And finally, the scales had stopped tilting. A year later, I visited the city where it had all begun. Ardent's old headquarters stood there still, glass and steel reflecting the afternoon light. The company was smaller now, humbler. A new CEO, younger, less theatrical, had taken over. She had been a project manager once, the kind who asked questions and actually listened. The building's reception desk had changed. The logo had been redesigned. everything seemed quieter, less arrogant. I didn't go inside, I didn't need to. Across the street was the small cafe where I had once spent nights debugging the first version of the payment module. I sat at my old corner table, ordered black coffee, and watched the building through the window. A few old colleagues passed by, none recognizing me. That was fine. In my bag, still encrypted, still untouched, was the architecture file, the key to everything that had started this. I had kept it not as leverage now, but as proof of memory, the bones of something I once loved. I opened my laptop, plugged in the old drive, and stared at the file name. Ardent Core Design, Inc. I hovered over delete for a long time. My hands trembled not with rage, but with release. In those seconds, everything I had carried, the betrayal, the humiliation, the nights of bitterness, felt like data waiting to be archived. Revenge had brought balance, truth had brought peace, but forgiveness, quiet, personal, unseen, was the final key. So I pressed delete. The progress bar filled slowly, erasing the ghost of my anger bite by bite. And when it was done, I didn't feel emptiness, I felt space. The kind of space where new things could be built, things untouched by bitterness. I walked outside. The city hummed the way only cities do, indifferent, alive, forgiving. Across the street, an ardent employee laughed over the phone, probably talking about a bug fix or a new client integration. I smiled faintly. The world had moved on, and so had I. That night, I received a final message from Tara, now a lead engineer at Ardent. Sir, I wanted to thank you. Things are different now. They use your principles in training, transparency, documentation, honesty. We call them the Felix Standards. I wish you could see it. I stared at the message for a long time. Then I typed back. No need, I already see it. Because the truth was, revenge hadn't destroyed Ardent. It had forced it to evolve, painfully, publicly, necessarily. And in that evolution, my story had become less about betrayal and more about boundaries. About how one man's refusal to stay silent made an entire system confront its own rot. I closed my laptop, finished my coffee, and stepped into the night. Somewhere above, the city lights flickered against the dark, like little lines of code, endless, restless, rewriting themselves into something new. In every code base, there's a comment section, small messages developers leave for those who come after. I once wrote one that said, "If you're reading this, take care of it, it's built with belief." Belief, that's what they broke first. But in the end, belief was also what I rebuilt. Not in them. In myself.